Tuesday, November 3rd, 2021. This morning, the news throws me a ledger that is really important that I had mentioned a few months back. I guess they got approval to finally throw a piece together on this television. I'm sticking with CBS 2 for no particular reason other than I started with a few pieces originally. It's what Linda watches, really. So it's what's on and what's been commandeered by the television into my, or pushed into my visual cortex. So I try to stay with that and then just add slight threads of other things for a visual acuity piece of what's being thrown, if you had a routine, into the whatever.
From #1 New York Times bestselling author Janet Ivanovich, Stephanie Plum is on the trail of a dangerous fugitive. But is she in over her head? She may be facing a new kind of villain, but she never misses her target. Game On by Janet Ivanovich.
President Biden left the UN climate change conference in Scotland with some important news about efforts to control global warming. Mr. Biden said the U.S. will join about 100 other countries to slash methane emissions by 30.
I've never been fortunate enough to go see that beautiful, I don't even know what you call it. Is it a valley with the high-peaked hills, the hills and the valleys?
30% by 2030. His administration is also launching a plan to cut U.S. methane emissions from oil and gas operations. Join us right now to break this all down, the impact that this will have, is meteorologist Megan Glaros. Good morning. How are you doing?
Yeah, good morning. Doing well. Listen, this is a big step because in 2019, methane emissions were ranked the highest that they've ever been. So we're talking about 2.5 times what they were in the pre-industrial era. This means it's having a huge effect on the climate. Now, we break it down in many different ways. A lot of times I think people think of methane emissions, they think simply of cows, right?
Yeah,
That's the thing that everybody's been hearing about.
Cows passing.
That's right.
Yes.
It's called enteric fermentation, by the way, if
There
you
you
like
go.
the scientific term.
That does sound better than
It
farming.
does.
I agree.
It does, but it's 27% of the emissions. When you look at what
I've never heard that phrase before. Hold on, let's go back to that.
effect on the climate. Now, we break it down in many different ways. A lot of times I think people think of methane emissions, they think simply of cows, right?
Yeah,
That's the thing that everybody's been
That's all the
hearing
news
about.
pushes.
That's right.
Yes.
It's called enteric fermentation, by the way.
Enteric
That
does sound better than
fermentation.
farming. I agree.
It does.
An intrinsic
But it's
value
27%
that
of
hits the
emissions. When you
extrinsic.
look at what oil and gas is adding to the picture, that's where you can really begin to move the marker. And what that means is if we can affect just a little bit of change in that sector, we're going to see a big impact down the line.
Go ahead.
Well, methane is essentially invisible, right? So
Yeah.
I'm the viewer at home. Tell me why it's so bad.
Yeah, because we hear mostly about CO2, don't we?
Yes.
We don't hear as much about methane, but actually in reality, methane has 80 times more warming potential than CO2. The difference is it's happening in the short term. So essentially what that means is carbon dioxide will stay in the atmosphere for a really long time. Methane is like in there, boom, it's doing a lot of warming.
For me, what's happening within this piece here, see how it's sphere and circle or sphere and sphere. All of a sudden, this part of the sphere up here, which I'm missing on my Rapoggle. So if this is the Earth, I know in German it's for 4 letters, it's E-R-T, they leave off the A, so it's E-R-T-E. And in another place that I love, it's E-R-D-E. I think Erd was the way that they spelled it. So this is the, because it's the ear things at 6 for theta. So there's the inner Earth, and then there's the outer Earth. The outer Earth being the the envelope, the seal, this almost looks like a cell. If you think about it, if you know RBCs and WBCs in some form of medical training, and I'm not talking like big medical, I'm talking like a few classes pre-medical, where they teach about the red blood cells, the white blood cells. So in here, you could have any of the seven or the category of white blood cells in theory, and then still be considered a white blood cell. And then sometimes, I mean, red blood cells don't have a nucleus. However, it's just in theory that it has this outer plasmic coating. If the plasmic coating starts, if outside here, let's call it the sun at the moment, if there's some kind of outside force that signals and is hitting this outside coating, that's where I talk about the artichoke effect, where it almost causes like these heat vents that then have different vibrational pieces in convection. So the convection changes, and then that becomes dangerous. But this is not something that you want. I mean, I don't understand why they would want to play around with, well, let's just see kind of a thing, because that's what it feels like humans have done. Not that I know who they might be in the world. That's what the true professionals know. But I just feel that at sometimes there could be certain pockets of this that even though it may look like it's it is totally a perfect sphere, as is this, or conical, there's a vortices that could spike and could cause localized pressure differential and barometric for the venal and arterial problem that I'm having right now. I was thinking this morning, I'm like, so, and they're confirming it for me. So it's like being in like a cheesecake almost. Your blood goes from being slightly thick in like it holds like a saline type, where it moves freely, but has a little different chemistry than just plain water, to more of a pudding and then a cheesecake. And as it's becoming more sludge-like in the outer extremities, it becomes harder to circulate. Also, the sun's microwave effects, or the convection effects, which are affected by a whole lot of different science in between. It used to be that if you stayed in the residence at some point in the artichoke exacerbation point of this global warming, climate change that actually does exist, the harmful things would stay, the rays would stay outside. At this point, on my camera, I've caught the particle destabilization in plasmic, whatever, with the black hole gravitational thing that they mentioned yesterday, actually traveling into the residence, whether the shades are open or closed. It's actually traveled into, so it's no longer conditioned to stay outside of a resident wall. So this way the anatomy is safe, which is really scary, because I'll put them back on. They say something about, oh my God, it's going to be really like a hot cup of tea. You'll die of microwave blood particles, coagulation, and things well before the boiling point, because we're already in a convection type scenario where you don't need to be immersed in liquid. It's actually the air around you moving in such a way that it's like being inside of a microwave, but the human anatomy doesn't know it or doesn't recognize or see it that way. And nobody's talking about it in that way, which is really dangerous. If you really want to change, and you really cared about the humans.
So with CO2, we know that's the single biggest contributing factor, but if we can start to move the dial on methane, maybe a bit of an easier, quicker fix, that buys us more time to implement those solutions to start to move the needle on CO2.
And we can move the dial on methane by doing what? What can we do?
Right, and that's something we need to think about in many different industries. But some of the little things that you can do, composting at home, just being aware of what you're doing as a consumer. And another thing to think about too is what this means for temperatures down the line. If we can start to dial back on the methane emissions, that's going to
Compost. You think of Woodrow and taking your garbage. I mean, it helps. Don't get me wrong, every little bit helps. But why would they not promote the cessation of automobile industry? I'm just curious. What is their necessity with moving the criminal children from everywhere? Why don't they spend the time, money, and effort on building the towns, the villages, and the local area, and allowing commercial or the agricultural use of vehicles where they live on places that have 20 miles between them and the sheriff's office? They need farm vehicles, they need some vehicles. But in a city, that's the first place you can cut back on all of this non-essential personal transport.
going to hopefully help us keep that temperature down. The goal is to keep that temperature to 2.7 degrees Celsius, the global warming. Keep it down to that. If we go above that, look at that picture on the right. Yeah. We're talking about mass.
Now here's my question. I arrived shortly after this. I fell into this human dilemma. I had to rely on two people that did not, my grandfather didn't have a car in this point. My parents had one car, I think it was like a Mazda, some little brown station wagon. It was a used feature, whatever, just so my dad could try to go around and find some work, just outside of this area because there wasn't work in this area. Between this and this, between this century 19 and century 20, decade 7, year 0, decade 2, year 0. In this time frame, look at what spiked up because of all of the really aggressive salespeople who had to have 1, 2, 3 personal transport vehicles and sports teams and flights and air travel and all these expensive, lavish hotels. I don't get to visit, but I see their commercials on the television of what they've been up to. They didn't invite me to participate, but they've been doing it the entire time. Where was world leadership and help at shutting all of that stuff down? Because now we're in a gamma field. This is a gamma right here. It's a split. It's turned on its side, which I call a ZA, Z-A, because we put it on a flag for ZA Nation. And it is now turned on its side. But I'll tell you something. Right now, there's also another feature that they use, and I don't know, but it looks like this. It looks like an I or a T, and then it looks like it comes in like this and out like that. There is a tree system that I walk by every day that has this shape, and it has 2 other branches, and then in the bottom it looks like a traditional Japanese bonsai tree for the root system. The root system is in a square at the bottom of this tree. It looks like this with the roots, and they stop. It's the most interesting, but it's a gigantic tree. So I don't know if it technically qualifies for bonsai because I don't know their art form, and I apologize if I misspeak, but I needed an example to understand what this significant smaller model in a larger model relationship could be. I've seen people on the television reference this thing, Japanese called bonsai tree where they trim the leaves. It's an art form. It's a craft within itself.
Massive increases in temperatures, right? That's going to impact cities all around the globe. Could potentially mean folks are having to move out of their homes because now we're talking about more hurricanes, bigger hurricanes, potential for droughts, fires, all of that getting a little bit more exacerbated.
So it was
We're already
Iowa
starting
and
to
now
see some of that
Boston.
now. But if we can't hold those temperatures down, all of that
Iowa
gets a
and
bit
Boston.
worse.
I've been reading that some of the methane issues is not production, but actually the pipes being leaky themselves. So we don't have to cut back, just have to kind of fix the technology we already have.
Right, and in reality, once you fix that technology, it may actually, in the end, mean that these companies are saving money or.
Now, are they talking about pipes like as if it's a pipeline instead of talking about supply chain? And with this egregious importing of all of the chemicals out in order to make this amount of, or surge in plastics and composite epoxy to make the new cars, because they used to be metal and sheet metal, and that was at least whatever, it was recyclable. Now it's different with this epoxy. That's a whole nother chemical process. But now they're saying it's a pipeline. It's more like chain supply is what it sounds like and looks like to me, based on all of the pieces of the ruzzle or the puzzle put together in some tetragrammaton.
Or it's little to no cost, and in some cases, they may actually be making some of that money back just by fixing these problems.
All right, and one sentence, if we don't do it, what happens to us?
We're going to get real hot, and that's not a good thing down the line.
You're going to microwave and cook yourselves on the street, and staying in the house is not going to be whatever, because the sideway waves of plasma and gravity are going to start leaching into the house and cooking you on the couch.
The line.
A cup of tea.
Yeah, not something you want.
All right, thank you, Megan.
Sure.
Coming up next, Vladimir Dutier. He's got the stories we think you're going to be talking about today. But first, it is 7:43. Time to check your local weather.
It is a cold morning across the tri-state area, so you will want a jacket or even a heavy coat as you head out the door. We've got temperatures below freezing for many locations this morning, this afternoon.
And that's the other thing. The microwaves, when you cook in the microwave oven, convection is due to air movement, air chemistry, and wavelength that hits you. The temperature in degrees Celsius or degree Fahrenheit doesn't always, you could be at a cool temperature, but still cooking on the inside. I know the women in my area suffer from a medical condition called menopause. At some point, they came out with this. My grandmother did not suffer from it, but my mom did really bad, where she would get heat flashes.